start? And which players should you leave on the bench for week 15? It's time. Playoff time. It's time to win a fantasy championship. I'm Mitch, and I'm here to give you 4 starts and 4 sits at every position for the first round of the fantasy football playoffs. The difference between advancing and going home might be that one decision you make. So this is my advice and my opinion on players you should play and players you shouldn't play. Let's get into it. But before I do, spike the like button and don't forget to subscribe for weekly stardom and sit-ems just like this. Let's get started with the quarterback position. The players you should start at quarterback. My first start is Kyler Murray versus my New England Patriots. Yeah, the first start in the video, I'm telling you to start the quarterback that's playing my favorite team. So you know I'm not biased. We're getting right into it with Kyler Murray, man. The Patriots have been pretty dreadful against quarterbacks and generally just bad on defense all year. They're 6th worst in passer rating allowed to quarterbacks this year. And the Patriots specifically lately have been awful against the quarterback position. They have allowed a top 10 quarterback in 5 games this season, and they have given up the 2nd most passing touchdowns since week 10. Touchdowns should be there for Kyler Murray. Points should be had for the Arizona Cardinals. This is a huge spot for the Cardinals. If they don't win this game, they're probably not winning their division. They're probably not making the playoffs. They have to win this game, and Kyler Murray has to show up. It's a perfect bounce back spot after a couple down games for the Arizona Cardinals. The second quarterback I would start this week is Justin Herbert versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I love how Herbert matches up with the Bucs defensively from a schematic perspective. There's only one team, the Indianapolis Colts, that plays more zone coverage than the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Bucs love to zone blitz. Herbert is one of the fastest minds in football at the quarterback position. He'll be able to vacate the zone in terms of finding the vacated zone, getting the ball out fast, and getting the ball to the receiver on time in space. When a team plays zone, it actually allows the quarterback to beat the defense instead of the receivers. When teams play more man, it puts more pressure on receivers, right? And the reason that's so important with Herbert is the fact that his receivers are not very good. But when teams play as much blitz and zone blitz as the Bucs do, it puts more pressure on the quarterback to find the open receiver, and all they have to do is catch and run with it. So I think Herbert has a big game here, considering that the Bucs have been poor against the pass all year. They've allowed the 4th most passing yards to the quarterback this season. The third option to start at quarterback this week is Drake May. Drake May is taking on Kyler Murray, and I like this game to be a shootout. I also think Drake May is a sneaky option off the waiver wire this week. May, in 8 full games this season, as a rookie, has put up 6 games of 15-plus points and 4 games of 20-plus points. So he is a pretty safe floor because he's very athletic and he can run. So that raises the floor. And he's also proven to be an efficient passer. The last time we saw him against the Colts, it might have been his best performance of his young career. He had about an 80% completion percentage in that game. And he's proven that he can go toe-to-toe with the best quarterbacks in terms of throwing the football, explosive plays, and being a quarterback that can carry an offense with his creativity and his legs. So Drake May, in a game where the Cardinals are going to score, he's going to have to keep pace. I like that for Drake May in fantasy. The fourth start at the quarterback position is Sam Darnold versus the Chicago Bears on Monday Night Football. Sam Darnold has been excellent for fantasy lately, and I don't see why you should fade him. Yes, Chicago has typically been a pretty good defense, but not against Darnold, and the way that he's playing, I feel like you have to keep him in your lineup. He's scored 19 plus points in 4 straight games. That's great consistency. The reason for that is the offense is humming. They've got great talent. Hawkinson, Jefferson, Addison, and O'Connell calling plays. I mean, this is just an offense that is hard to stop. You include his performance against the Bears, where he had 21.1 points and 330 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. That was in Chicago, outdoors. Now it's Monday Night Football, primetime setting in a dome. I love Darnold here to be able to continue his 2 touchdown a game, 300-yard type passing performance against the Bears. The quarterback sits. I'm going to go with Tua turned the ball over this week, right? We talked about how Tua was going to be Tagovailoa last week. He's going to be turned the ball over this week, okay? He plays the Texans, and the Texans defense, I think, out of the bye week is going to be prepared for Tua. First of all, DeMeco Ryans comes from San Francisco. Mike McDaniel comes from San Francisco. They're both very familiar with each other's game, so to speak, right? DeMeco's going to understand this offense. He's going to understand how to attack it, how to attack the protections, how to get after Tua, how to limit those receivers. And this is the best defense, objectively, that Tua has faced since returning, right? He's beat up on a lot of easy defenses, like the Patriots, like the Raiders, like the Jets, right? Like, he's beat up on easy defenses. He's put up big numbers against easy defenses. The only great game I thought he had against an above average defense was Buffalo, and that's a familiar opponent. The Texans, not as much. The Texans are second in net yards per attempt. They have one of the best pass rushes in football, and they also are second in interceptions forced. So this could just not be a high ceiling game. And Tua, is somebody that doesn't run a lot, doesn't really have a high ceiling in a game against a great pass defense and a very good pass rush on the road. So I just don't love this spot. I just prefer other options. Tua has been very good to you, but if you have other options, let's say like a Brock Purdy or a Herbert or a Murray on your team, I'd prefer those type of options just this week for Tua. Baker Mayfield versus the Chargers is somebody that I've been hot on all year. I love Baker, how he's playing. I don't love him in this game against the Chargers. The Chargers are 7th best against fantasy quarterbacks this year. They also have the best defense in terms of points allowed, and they're also top 5 in net yards per attempt and interceptions forced. So just like the Texans, very good pass defense. What I don't like about Baker against the Chargers is the Chargers like to play a lot of zone. They like to cloud the field with zone. They like to send 4 men at the quarterback. They like to rush 4. They have a decent 4-man rush because they have very good edge rushers like Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa. They can get a little bit of pressure there on Baker, force maybe a couple key sacks. But we've seen Baker play defenses like this, like the Niners, right, for example, and he didn't have his best performance. So I think there's going to be a lot of short passes for Baker, a lot of running for the Bucs in this game. I don't think there's going to be a lot of explosive plays to be had here. And also, we've seen Baker be a lot more turnover prone lately. And I think with the way that the Chargers play defensively, it's going to force some tight windows that maybe he doesn't see coming, and that could be interceptions. So I just don't love this matchup. Not a huge ceiling against a good defense in the Chargers that don't allow a lot of points. Russell Wilson versus the Philadelphia Eagles will be the 3rd sit at quarterback. Russell Wilson is taking on arguably the best defense in football. The Eagles are 2nd in points allowed and 1st in yards allowed this season as a defense collectively. They're also 1st in net yards per attempt through the passing game. So excellent pass defense, very good cornerbacks, and a solid pass rush. They only allow 199 yards per game to the quarterback position. Russ does not have George Pickens. Doesn't make a lot of sense to play him. Geno Smith at home versus the Green Bay Packers. This matchup isn't exactly terrible. Like, the Packers are 12th best against quarterbacks. That's not bad. That's above average. But, you know, it's more about Geno, right? Like, Geno, 3 touchdowns in 4 games. That's not fantasy viable. You kind of include the fact that he's only averaged 13.5 fantasy points since the bye week. That's 4 games. That's a month of football. And I don't love Geno in this setting. I also think Jair Alexander will return, which will help them cover DK Metcalf. And this is actually probably the best pass rush the Seahawks have played since they played the Niners, which was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. So yeah, like, Geno shouldn't have a huge performance here, even at home against the Packers. Moving to the running back position, I like Ramondre Stevenson to have a good game at the Arizona Cardinals. The Cardinals last week allowed Zach Charbonnet, a backup of the Seahawks, to have a huge game, 134 yards and 7 catches, right? He had like 29 touches. Ramondre Stevenson sees similar workload. He's going to see catches. He's going to see runs. Now, I'm I'm not sure if New England is quite as good at run blocking as Seattle, but I do think Stevenson, in a game that could feature a lot of points where both teams get to the 20s, in my opinion, he could have 1 or maybe 2 touchdowns. I certainly could see him catching the ball 4 or 5 times, and I think he could get 15 to 20 carries. So I think Stevenson is a great RB2 option, and if you're a little bit deeper, a flex option against the Cardinals in potentially a high-scoring game. The Cardinals also allow the 7th most receptions to running backs, and Stevenson is a pretty decent receiver in his own right. Rico Dowdle at the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers are the worst run defense in the league, and over the past month, Rico has been very good for the Cowboys. He is actually RB18 in fantasy, and he's seeing RB20 usage. So he's certainly an RB2 right now, and I think he's definitely going to be somebody that is viable during the fantasy playoffs against the worst run D in the league. Zach Charbonnet versus the Green Bay Packers. We already brought him up. He was extremely impressive. 29 touches, over 190 total yards, 2 touchdowns against the Arizona Cardinals. Against the Packers, a team that I think you can run the ball on. We saw that with the Lions. I think that's going to be the main component of the Seahawks' success offensively in this game, especially if there is a little bit of rain in this game, which is always possible in Seattle. I think Charbonnet will catch the ball, run the ball, be the workhorse, and if he is the workhorse for the Seahawks, he's a must start each and every week pretty much. Brian Robinson Jr. of the Commanders versus the Saints. The Saints allow the highest yards per carry in the NFL, and they also allow one of the highest rates of touchdowns to running backs. They allow over a touchdown per game to the running back position, so efficiency will be had by Brian Robinson, and I think the Commanders will run all over the Saints after the bye week, especially considering that they don't have Derek Carr anymore. So this should be a blowout, which means more rushing attempts, means you're eating clock, means you're running the ball at the end of the game. So I love Brian Robinson. Think he's going to go off. Running back sits DeAndre Swift at the Minnesota Vikings. Swift has a terrible matchup here, and they have not been running the ball lately that well. I mean, last week it was awful against the 49ers, and if you played him, you were in trouble. At Minnesota, I mean, the Vikings are excellent against the run, right? They allow under 4 yards per attempt to running backs this year. They also allow half a touchdown per game to running backs, which is one of the better rates as well. So terrible matchup, not a very good running offense. Maybe Swift catches the ball if they're down in the game, but I don't love this. I don't love the upside. I'd sit Swift. Nick Chubb versus the Kansas City Chiefs. I love Chubb, but so far hasn't been himself. I'd look at the Chiefs and say, well, this is the best team in fantasy football against the running back position. They only allow 58 yards per game. I think this is going to be a big Jameis throwing the football game to guys like Moore and Judy, Njoku, and Tillman. I think Winston's going to quietly have a good game, but I think that's going to come at the expense of Nick Chubb having a decent day on the ground. So don't expect Chubb to be a big part of the game plan against a beat-up secondary in Kansas City. Tyrone Tracy Jr. versus Baltimore. I like Tracy a lot, and I like how he's playing, but this is not an ideal matchup. If you have better alternatives with more upside, I would lean towards those guys. In my league, I have an option between Stevenson and Tracy, and I'm leaning towards Stevenson due to the matchup, that type of deal, right? So Tracy playing Baltimore, they're like the second best team in yards per attempt allowed on the ground. They're excellent against the run. They suffer against the pass. And the fact is, the Ravens are 16-point favorites, which means the game is going to be over before you know it, which means the running game is not going to be a proponent of the Giants offense. Gus Edwards is our final sit. At this point, if you're starting Gus Edwards, I don't know, you're boneheaded, versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Gus Edwards hasn't scored over 10 fantasy points all season, and he's the starter of their backfield. Just because he's the starter doesn't make him a start, all right? Let's move to the wide receiver position, beginning with Amari Cooper of the Buffalo Bills. I think it will be a bounce back game for the Bills as a team, but their offense was humming versus the Los Angeles Rams, and Cooper was a big part of it. He had 6 receptions on 14 targets for 95 yards versus the Rams. And when you look at the Lions like to play a lot of man coverage. One of the reasons that Amari Cooper was brought to Buffalo is because of his ability to run routes and separate. So I think Cooper will have a day against Carlton Davis, and I could see him having a similar 100-yard day for the Buffalo Bills and Josh Allen. Another great route runner is Calvin Ridley. He takes on the Cincinnati Bengals. He's been seeing a lot of targets and has had some good games lately, but mostly lately he's been a little underwhelming. I like him against the Bengals because the Bengals secondary is absolute trash. They might have the worst defense I've ever seen. They have cornerbacks Josh Newton, Cam Taylor-Britt, and Marco Wilson who can't cover a soul, and certainly not Calvin Ridley. So I think with 12 targets last week in a game where the Bengals are going to move the ball and score, not like Jacksonville, I think Ridley's going to see plenty of volume and probably plenty of yards. I think Tennessee can score on the Bengals because everybody can. Jordan Addison versus the Chicago Bears. Addison went absolutely nuclear versus the Bears in the first game. 8 catches, 162 yards on 9 targets. Very efficient. Last week he had 3 touchdowns. I think you just keep him in your lineup, man. He's been absolutely incredible. So yeah, he had some rough points earlier in the year, but I think you can trust him now, especially at home in a game where it's in prime time. You know, Justin Jefferson has seen a lot of attention from the Bears in his recent performances in games. So I think they're going to double him a lot, which leaves Addison better advantageous matchups. And then lastly, at the wide receiver starts, we've got Adam Thielen. You've got to start Adam Thielen at this point versus Dallas. 23 points, 19 points back-to-back games, 17 catches, 200 receiving yards, and a touchdown over the last 2 games. He's become Bryce Young's #1 target again in 2024, like he was in 2023. He looks like his old self, and this is a game where the Panthers are favored, which means Thielen might hit the end zone because they're expected to score and win, which is very odd because the Panthers have not been favored for 2 years. But Adam Thielen, I think, is going to have a big game because of it. Wide receiver starts. I'd sit D-Hop versus the Cleveland Browns. DeAndre Hopkins. He's taking on Denzel Ward, in my opinion, the best man-to-man corner in football, and they allow the second least amount of receptions in the NFL to the wide receiver position. The reason for that is the Browns play a lot of man coverage, which leads to a low completion percentage. And when you have a guy like DeAndre Hopkins, who at this point in his career is, you know, a little slower, not a great quickness or, you know, route runner extraordinaire in terms of separation skills. He's more in Kansas City for his jump ball ability, his great hands, and his ability to find soft spots in zone. But he won't be facing a lot of zone. He'll be facing rather Emerson or, of course, Ward, which is going to be a tough matchup either way. So I don't see a huge ceiling for him in this game. Marvin Harrison Jr. has not been trustworthy lately, and he's going to be facing Christian Gonzalez, who is one of the best corners in football. If the Patriots have anything good defensively, it is Gonzalez, and he usually shuts people down. I see this as a game where he will shadow Harrison because he's clearly the best receiver on the team, most talented receiver on the team, and he plays on the perimeter the most, where Gonzalez typically does cover. And, you know, you look at Harrison, he just hasn't been very good lately. 3 games under 10 points in the last 5 games. Like, that's not worth starting in a must-win matchup. Michael Pittman Jr. versus the Denver Broncos. Pat Surtain is an excellent shutdown corner. Pittman has been terrible lately. He has failed to finish with double-digit fantasy points in all but 1 of his last 6 games. Marquez Valdez-Scantling is our last wide receiver sit of the video versus Washington. Why? No Derek Carr. So I don't really know what Jake Haener is going to do in terms of attempts, like where he's going to go with the ball, who he's going to target, where the volume is going to go to. It's a lot different with different quarterbacks depending on where they like to throw the ball, where their heat map is at, right? Like, do they like tight ends? Do they like running backs? Do they like, you know, the left side of the field, the right side of the field, short, intermediate, deep? And considering Haener is not a deep downfield guy, it's more of short completions. That's not Valdez-Scantling's game, so I hate him this week, especially considering it might be a Lattimore revenge game as he'll be activated for the Commanders in this matchup. At the tight end position, I'll be starting Jake Ferguson this week against Carolina. It's the worst defense against tight ends in the NFL. Carolina sucks against running backs and tight ends, right? Carolina, no team has allowed more fantasy points to tight ends this season. Only 1 has given up more points since week 7. So not only have they been terrible all year, but you might think, okay, you know, Carolina's been a better team. Maybe they've been better lately. No, they still since week 7, they've been awful. So Ferguson doesn't exactly look like he's been given the tight end 1 job. You know, like Schoonmaker has been more involved than you would have thought, but I think that was only because the Bengals are bad against tight ends as well. So you could see both of them involved. Secondly, I think that he was just working his way back from the injury as well. So he did see 6 targets against Cincinnati. Against Carolina, he's likely to turn 6 targets into 5 catches, right? So I think Ferguson is going to be really solid for you. Probably not amazing, but he might hit the end zone. He'll probably convert multiple first downs. I like the floor with him this week. Tucker Kraft versus Seattle. Seattle has allowed the 12th most fantasy points to tight ends, and Kraft has been hot lately. I mean, he's scored at least 10.6 fantasy points in 3 straight games, and Kraft looked great against Detroit. Like, I thought he had a great game. He pulled the whole Shawn Michaels out on the field, got jacked up, and then he just pulled that flip on the field, kick up. Right? That's athletic enough to be in my lineup. TJ Hawkinson versus the Chicago Bears. The Bears. Hawkinson has had 7 catches on 9 targets for 114 yards in his first matchup against the Bears. Whenever somebody has that good of a game against an opponent, I'm going to start him. You're probably starting Hawkinson anyways, but the last couple of weeks, he hasn't exactly been fantastic. I think he bounces back this week against a familiar foe that he's used to putting up points against. Hunter Henry versus the Cardinals will be our final start at the tight end position. With Drake May at quarterback, Henry is averaging 7.3 targets. That's a lot for a tight end. 5.3 catches, 54 yards, and 11.4 fantasy points per game. He's a tight end 1. So if he's on your waiver wire, pick him up. Start him. It's a game that will feature points. Henry will get some points for your fantasy team. Tight end sits. Evan Ingram versus the Jets. This is the team that is 9th best against tight ends, the Jets. And when you look at Ingram, he's only put up 28 receiving yards, 41 receiving yards, and 33 receiving yards the last 3 weeks. That's not good enough. He's also banged up. He did not practice on Wednesday, so be aware of that. Kyle Pitts versus the Raiders. I mean, if you're starting Kyle Pitts, you're probably not in the playoffs, but how can you trust this guy, man? Like, how can you trust this guy? In 4 of his last 5 games, Pitts has had 1 reception for fewer than 15 yards. He's averaging 3.2 fantasy points in that span. That is 4 of the last 5 games. Kyle Pitts is a bust. Deal with it. Dalton Kincaid versus the Detroit Lions. This is the best defense quietly versus the tight end position. Kincaid is coming back from injury, so maybe the Bills will look to get him involved, but I think this is going to be a Shakir and a Cooper and a Coleman game, not necessarily a Kincaid and Knox game. I think the Lions will slow down the tight ends, and my reasoning for that is because the Lions play a lot of man and they like to blitz a lot, it keeps tight ends into block a lot, I would expect, which would lead to a lot less receptions and overall volume. So I think Kincaid will be busy being physical out there and not necessarily catching footballs for touchdowns. Sam Laporta versus the Buffalo Bills on the flip side. I think a lot of you are going to start him because you probably drafted him very early or you traded for him with the excitement of the down stretch, the rest of the season. But Sam Laporta has not been great, and this is a team that allows the lowest yards per catch to tight ends in football, the Buffalo Bills. And they're the 3rd best team overall at limiting fantasy points to the tight end position. So if you have a better alternative, I'd rather play Hawkinson, Henry, Kraft, maybe even Ferguson over Sam Laporta this week. It's not a good matchup, and Laporta is wickedly inconsistent. So yeah, I would sit him if I had a good alternative. Now we're going to add a little bit of a twist. We're going to give you some defensive starts for the video because it is the playoffs, so I feel like defenses are worth a shout. I'm not going to go too far deep into it. It's going to be pretty simple. I like a couple defenses that are under the radar this week. We got Washington versus the Saints. It's Jake Haener. He's a backup quarterback. He's a second-year pro. He's barely started. They don't have any weapons. Marquez Valdez, Scantling, Joan Johnson, Taysom Hill's out. Chris Olave's out. Rashid Shaheed's out. Now Derek Carr's out. Commanders should eat on defense. Atlanta Falcons. I like them against Desmond Ridder because Desmond Ridder is really bad at football. I don't think I have to say anything else. Desmond Ridder sucks. So yeah, the Falcons defense isn't exactly great, but this is a desperation spot. Monday Night Football. They gotta win. I like the Falcons defense a little bit. And then 2 defenses that are probably already owned. I would not swap them out for alternatives. The Vikings versus Chicago. Caleb Williams takes way too many sacks. He holds on the ball way too long. It's in Minnesota. They're going to take a million penalties at the line of scrimmage. And yeah, they might be chasing points at the end of the game, which might hurt you a little bit, but sacks and turnovers are very real in this game. So I like the Vikings defense a lot. And then Baltimore versus the Giants. I mean, it speaks for itself. 16-point favorites. All right. Baltimore has not been a great fantasy defense. They have not been a great defense in general, which means they're probably on the waiver wire, or they were. So I really like their matchup against Drew Lock, the worst offensive line in football. I think they shut down the run, force Lock to throw. It's going to lead to sacks. It's going to lead to turnovers. It's going to lead to good fantasy points for your defense. Those are my starts and my sits for the first round of the fantasy football playoffs. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and at least learned something from this information. If you did, Gronk spike the like button and subscribe, guys. I'll be back very soon. Hopefully you advance and you're back here for week 16. Peace.